Before he became a king, he was only a shepherd, a boy forgotten in the fields of Bethlehem. Yet destiny was already calling his name. He would defeat a giant that terrified an entire army. He would become the greatest king Israel had ever known. But his story was not only about victory. It was a story of betrayal, war, love, and devastating failure. A man chosen by God who would one day fall into terrible sin. This is the story of the rise, the fall, and the redemption of David, the shepherd who became a king. In the quiet hills of Bethlehem, long before the throne, long before the battles, there was a shepherd boy. His name was David. He was the youngest son of Jesse of Bethlehem, the smallest in the family, the one sent to the fields when the others stood in the house, the one forgotten when guests arrived, the one no one expected. But heaven saw him. While his brothers trained for war, David learned the language of silence. He walked the rocky hills beneath endless skies. He listened to the wind move through olive trees. He guarded sheep that did not know his name. Day after day, night after night, and in that wilderness, God was shaping a king. When a lion came from the shadows, David did not run. When a bear seized a lamb from the flock, David pursued. He struck the beast. He rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when the predator turned against him, he seized it and killed it. No crowd applauded. No soldier saluted. No king rewarded him. But God was watching. In the loneliness of those fields, David sang. His harp echoed across valleys, songs of trust, songs of longing, songs born not from comfort, but from dependence. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Before David would ever shepherd a nation, he learned what it meant to be shepherded by God. He learned to trust. He learned to worship. He learned to listen. Meanwhile, in the palace of Israel, a different story was unfolding. King Saul, once chosen, once anointed, had turned from obedience. Pride replaced humility. Fear replaced faith. And the word of the Lord came through the prophet Samuel. The Lord has rejected you from being king. The throne of Israel would change, but God's choice would not look like man's choice. God spoke to Samuel, "Fill your horn with oil. I am sending you to Bethlehem. I have chosen a king among the sons of Jesse." Samuel obeyed. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders trembled. "Do you come in peace?" He did. Jesse and his sons were called forward. One by one they passed before the prophet. Eliab, tall, strong, impressive. Surely this was the one. But the Lord whispered to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." One by one the sons passed. Abinadab, Shammah, 7 in total. 7 times, no. Samuel turned to Jesse. "Are these all your sons?" Jesse hesitated. "There remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep." Keeping the sheep, still in the fields, still unseen. "Send for him," Samuel said. "We will not sit down until he comes." Somewhere beyond the town, a shepherd boy was called home. Dust on his clothes, sun in his eyes, no idea that history was shifting. He entered the house. The room was silent. Brothers lined the walls. The prophet stood waiting, and then the Lord spoke. "Arise, anoint him. This is the one." Not the tallest, not the oldest, not the obvious, the shepherd. Samuel stepped forward. He lifted the horn of oil and poured it over David's head. Oil ran down his hair, across his face, onto the shoulders of a shepherd.
In the presence of his brothers, God chose him. And in that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. A king had been anointed, but there was no crown, no throne, no army waiting outside. When the ceremony ended, David returned to the fields, anointed but not appointed, chosen but not elevated. This is the mystery of God's calling. The oil marked him, but the process would shape him. He did not force destiny. He did not demand recognition. He did not announce his anointing. He waited, and in the waiting, God built depth. As the Spirit of the Lord rested on David, it departed from Saul. The king became restless, troubled, tormented. His servants searched for relief. They said, "Find someone who can play the harp, someone skillful, someone the Lord is with." And they found David. The shepherd was summoned to the palace, not as king, but as a musician. When David played, peace filled the room. The torment lifted. The king was soothed. The boy from Bethlehem stood in royal halls, holding a harp instead of a sword. God was positioning him, teaching him, preparing him. David observed leadership up close. He learned restraint. He learned humility. He learned to serve the very throne he would one day inherit. He did not grasp for power. He honored the office, even when the man faltered. This is how God writes his stories. He does not begin with crowns. He begins with character. He does not start with applause. He starts with obedience in obscurity. David was overlooked by men, but chosen by God. In lonely fields, under silent stars, with nothing but sheep and song, a king was being formed. Before giants fell, before armies marched, before nations sang his name, a shepherd learned to trust, a boy learned to worship, a heart aligned with heaven. In Bethlehem's quiet hills, destiny wore simple clothes. Oil fell quietly, a promise was spoken, and history changed forever. The shepherd had been chosen, the king was coming. But first, there would be preparation.
The Valley of Elah, David and Goliath. The sun rose slowly over the rugged hills of Judah, casting long shadows across the dry earth of the Valley of Elah. Two armies stood facing one another across that ancient valley, silent, tense, unmoving. On one side were the warriors of Israel, led by King Saul, tall, armored, chosen once for his strength and presence. On the other side stood the Philistines, hardened fighters from the coastal plains, confident in their weapons, certain of their power. Between them lay a wide stretch of dust and stone, a battlefield waiting for blood. For 40 days, neither side advanced, because of one man. From the Philistine camp emerged a giant, a warrior so enormous that he seemed less like a man and more like a living fortress. His name was Goliath of Gath. His height towered over the tallest soldiers. Bronze armor covered his chest like a shielded wall. Greaves wrapped around his legs. A helmet crowned his head. The shaft of his spear was thick as a weaver's beam, its iron tip gleaming in the sun. The weight of his armor alone was enough to crush an ordinary man. But it was not only his size that terrified Israel, it was his voice. Each morning and each evening, Goliath stepped forward into the center of the valley and roared his challenge. "Choose a man and let him come down to me. If he can fight and kill me, we will become your servants. But if I kill him, you will serve us." His words echoed against the hills. They carried not just strength, but mockery.
They cursed the armies of Israel. They defied their king. They defied their God. And the soldiers of Israel trembled. Even King Saul, once fearless in battle, felt his courage dissolve beneath the weight of the giant's shadow. No warrior stepped forward. No sword was drawn. Day after day, shame settled like dust over the camp. 40 days, 40 mornings of humiliation, 40 evenings of fear. Far from the battlefield, in the hills of Bethlehem, a shepherd boy tended sheep beneath open skies. His name was David. He was the youngest son of Jesse, the overlooked one, the boy who carried bread instead of weapons, the musician who played the harp to calm troubled spirits, the one who had already been secretly anointed by the prophet Samuel, though few knew it. David did not look like a warrior, but he knew something about battles. He had fought lions that threatened his flock. He had torn bears from the throats of sheep. Alone in the wilderness, armed only with a sling and unwavering trust in the Lord, he had learned that courage is not born in crowds. It is forged in secret places. One day, Jesse called David from the fields. "Take this grain, this bread, and these cheeses to your brothers," he said. "See how they are doing. Bring back news." David rose early. He left the sheep with another shepherd. He carried provisions on his back and walked the long road toward the valley of Elah, unaware that history was waiting for him there. As he approached the Israelite camp, he heard it, the thunderous, mocking voice rolling through the valley. Goliath had stepped forward again. David ran toward the battle line to see what was happening. Soldiers shifted nervously. Some looked away. Others whispered in fear. And then David saw him, the giant, towering, armored, defiant. When Goliath finished his challenge, silence followed, the same heavy silence that had lasted for 40 days. David looked from the giant to the soldiers. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The men stared at him. Some scoffed, others shook their heads. They told him of the king's promise, riches, honor, even the king's daughter in marriage to whoever defeated the giant. But David was not thinking about reward. He was thinking about dishonor. His older brother Eliab overheard him speaking. Anger flared in his eyes. "Why have you come down here? With whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the evil of your heart. You came down only to watch the battle." David absorbed the accusation quietly. "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" He turned away from his brother and continued asking questions, his voice steady, his conviction growing stronger with every word spoken against the giant. Soon, word of the shepherd boy's boldness reached King Saul. David was summoned. The king studied him, young, unarmored, inexperienced. "You are not able to go against this Philistine. You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David did not waver. "Your servant used to keep my father's sheep," he began. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." He lifted his eyes to meet the king's. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." It was not arrogance, it was memory. Saul hesitated, then nodded. "Go, and the Lord be with you." The king placed his own armor on David, bronze helmet, heavy coat, sword at his side. David tried to walk. He could not. The armor did not fit. It was not his. "I cannot go in these," he said, removing them carefully. "I am not used to them." Instead, he took what he knew, his staff, his shepherd's bag, his sling. And from the brook in the valley, he selected 5 small stones against a giant clad in bronze. As David stepped forward, crossing into the open valley, the Philistine army stirred. Laughter rippled through their ranks. Goliath saw him coming. At first, he did not understand. Then he saw clearly. Not a soldier, not a warrior, but a boy. He sneered. "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he roared, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." The valley held its breath. David did not slow. He did not tremble. Instead, he answered, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The words rang with authority beyond his size. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Something shifted in the air. Goliath moved forward, shield-bearer ahead of him, spear ready. David ran, not away, toward him. In one fluid motion, he reached into his bag, drew out a stone, placed it in his sling, and began to whirl it above his head. The sound cut through a valley, leather slicing air. The giant advanced, confident, certain of victory. David released. The stone flew with precision born of years in the fields. It struck Goliath in the forehead, the only exposed place between helmet and armor. The impact was sharp, decisive. The giant staggered. His eyes widened in shock. Then the unthinkable happened. Goliath fell, forward, face to the ground. The earth trembled beneath him. Silence. Absolute silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then David ran forward, stood over the fallen warrior, drew Goliath's own sword, and ended the battle. The giant was dead. Across the valley, the Philistines stared in disbelief. Their champion, their symbol of invincibility, lay motionless in the dust. Fear, once gripping Israel, now seized the enemy. They fled. And the army of Israel found its voice again. A roar rose from the hills as they surged forward, pursuing the fleeing Philistines all the way to their cities. Victory had come. Not through armor, not through size, not through experience, but through faith. That day, the Valley of Elah became more than a battlefield. It became a testimony, a reminder that power is not measured in height, that courage is not determined by age, that impossible odds bow before unwavering trust. As the sun set over the valley, David stood among seasoned warriors, no longer merely the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. He had faced the impossible and prevailed. But this was only the beginning, because in defeating the giant,
the Valley of Elah still echoed with the cries of a fallen giant. The shepherd boy's name was whispered in every corner of Israel. David, the boy who faced Goliath with nothing but a sling, a stone, and faith in the living God. The one who declared, "The battle belongs to the Lord." And yet, when the giant fell, another force began to rise. Not in David, but in the heart of a king. The people celebrated. Women poured into the streets with tambourines and songs. Joyous voices lifted high, praising victory. But in their songs, there was a dangerous comparison. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. To the common ear, it was honor, but to King Saul, it was a dagger. The crown weighed heavier on his head that day. The words echoed long after the music faded. He had been king,
anointed and chosen, yet the people now whispered of another, a young shepherd who had achieved what he could not. Saul watched David, not as a loyal servant, not as a brave warrior, but as a rival. At first, the feeling was subtle, a whisper in the mind, a tightening of the jaw. But jealousy grows quietly. It creeps into the heart, poisoning trust, blurring reason, and twisting pride into fear. And Saul's fear was deep. He had once been empowered by God's Spirit, but after disobedience and the prophet Samuel's harsh words, "The Lord has torn the kingdom from you and given it to one better than you," his heart was restless. David, unawares, played his harp as he always had, soothing the king's troubled spirit. But Saul no longer heard music. He heard a reminder, a rival, a destiny that threatened him. One day, in a fit of rage, Saul grabbed a spear. It flew through the air toward David. The young warrior moved just in time. Twice that day, Saul hurled death at a man who had done nothing but serve faithfully. And each time, David's life was spared. Yet the warning was clear. The palace had become a battlefield. Saul tried to control the threat. He sent David to lead battles, hoping the enemy would take him, but every campaign ended in victory. David's fame grew, the people loved him, and the Spirit of the Lord remained with him. And Saul's envy grew into hatred. Even a marriage became a weapon. Saul gave his daughter to David, hoping to ensnare him, yet each obstacle David overcame only deepened Saul's fear. But there was hope in one corner of the palace: Jonathan, Saul's son. Jonathan saw David not as a rival, but as a brother. Their bond was unshakable. Jonathan defended David, reminding Saul of his faith and loyalty. For brief moments, Saul's anger would simmer, but jealousy is relentless. The breaking point came at a feast. Words escalated, anger erupted, and Saul's hand nearly struck his own son in fury. Jonathan realized the danger. He secretly warned David, "You must flee. The king's heart is not under wisdom, but in envy." And so David fled. From celebrated hero to fugitive in a day, the palace doors closed behind him, replaced by wilderness nights, caves, and shadows. Saul's hatred had transformed loyalty into exile. Yet David did not raise his hand against the king. Even in moments of opportunity, he declared, "I will not harm the Lord's anointed." Saul's jealousy reveals a truth as old as time. Comparison poisons the soul. It turns victories into threats, friends into enemies, and triumph into torment. Saul saw David's rise as his loss, forgetting that David's destiny was ordained by God. David's flight became his preparation. He learned patience, restraint, and leadership forged in hardship. He witnessed the devastation jealousy can cause, dividing families, scattering armies, corrupting hearts. And in that wilderness, he grew ready for the crown that would one day be his. Jealousy is subtle. It begins as a whisper, a song, a fleeting thought. Left unchecked, it becomes a roaring storm, hurling spears, destroying trust, and consuming the soul. Saul's envy not merely threatened David, it consumed the man who once held the scepter. Through it all, David's faith remained steadfast. He learned that true power is not taken through force, but received through divine appointment. He learned mercy, patience, and the weight of restraint. And when the day came for him to ascend the throne, he did so not in vengeance, but in wisdom born from trials. The rise of Saul's envy is a story of warning, of how a heart consumed by fear and envy can destroy even the anointed, even the chosen. And yet, it is also a story of hope, of how faith, integrity, and patience prepare the faithful for the destiny God has written. In the end, the Battle of Elah was not just about a fallen giant. It was a prelude, a shadow war between a king and a shepherd, between jealousy and faith, between a throne seized by fear and a crown bestowed by God. And as David walked through the wilderness, harps in hand, hearts loyal to him, and the Spirit of the Lord guiding his steps, one truth remained: you cannot destroy what God has anointed. No spear, no hatred, no jealousy, no human scheme can stop what is destined. Saul's shadow fell long and heavy, but David's light only grew brighter. The shepherd who slew giants, who fled a king's wrath, who endured the wilderness with patience, would rise, and Israel would see that jealousy may rage in a king's heart, but destiny belongs to the faithful.
David's friendship with Jonathan.
In the golden hills of ancient Israel, where the sun kissed the valleys and shadows stretched long across the stone walls of the city, a young man named David had already begun to carve his name into the hearts of men. His courage against the giant Goliath had made him more than a shepherd boy. He was now a hero in the eyes of the people. But fame, as history often whispers, comes with a price, and in the midst of rising kingship and growing tension, a friendship would blossom, a bond so profound it would challenge the very power that sought to destroy it. Jonathan, the son of King Saul, walked through the corridors of the palace with a mixture of pride and unease. The people spoke of David's victory as though he were a living legend, and the songs in the streets celebrated his valor. Yet in the heart of the royal family, whispers carried fear and envy. Jonathan, heir to the throne, felt a shadow stretch over his inheritance. He should have felt rivalry, but instead, when his eyes met David's, he saw something more than a warrior. He saw a soul that mirrored his own. Their first meeting was marked by a simple moment, almost ordinary, yet destined for the extraordinary. David had come to the palace, called before the king, his armor still glinting from battle. Jonathan approached him, not as a prince to a hero, but as a man recognizing another man. He spoke words that would echo through the ages. "I love him as my own soul." It was a declaration that transcended loyalty, politics, and fear, a covenant between two hearts, bound by respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding that neither would betray the other. From that day forward, David and Jonathan were inseparable. They walked the hills together, spoke under the shade of olive trees, and shared dreams not just of victories in battle, but of lives unburdened by the weight of crowns and expectation. Jonathan admired David's courage, the strength that seemed to radiate from every fiber of his being. David, in turn, revered Jonathan's integrity, the noble heart that never wavered, even in the face of his father's jealousy. But peace is fragile, and envy is relentless. King Saul, once proud of David, now watched him with suspicion. Every cheer from the people, every song sung in David's honor, stirred a storm in the heart of the king. Saul's eyes, once warm with pride, became sharp with anger. And as his plans to harm David grew more frequent, the young warrior found himself caught in a web of palace intrigue, unsure of whom to trust. It was in these moments of peril that Jonathan's loyalty shone brightest. Knowing his father's intentions, Jonathan did not hesitate. He warned David, guiding him through the labyrinth of danger, offering not just counsel, but a shield forged from friendship. "Go in safety," Jonathan would say, his hand resting on David's shoulder, a silent vow that no harm would befall him while Jonathan could prevent it. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of politics and paternal wrath, their bond a fortress against the fear that sought to swallow them both. Yet their friendship was more than strategy and survival.
In the quiet moments, away from the palace and the battlefield, they shared laughter and tears, dreams and fears. They spoke of the future, not just as soldiers, but as men longing for justice, for peace, for lives not defined by the ambitions of others. Jonathan gave David his robe, his armor, even his sword, a symbolic passing of favor, an acknowledgement that though they walked different paths, their hearts were united. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any words, a declaration of trust so absolute that it defied even the looming shadow of death. But even the strongest bonds are tested. As Saul's wrath intensified, David was forced to flee, leaving behind the city, the palace, and the man he had come to love like a brother. The night before his departure was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes words impossible. Jonathan and David met in secret, beneath the stars that had witnessed their countless conversations, their laughter, and their vows. Tears fell freely as Jonathan spoke, "Go in peace, for we have sworn this covenant before God." Their hands clasped, and in that moment there was no prince and no hero, only two souls bound by loyalty, by love, and by the unbreakable threads of friendship. David fled, carrying not just the weight of survival, but the memory of a friendship that would sustain him through the darkest valleys. Jonathan returned to the palace, facing his father's wrath with courage, knowing that his heart had chosen loyalty over fear. And though the paths of these two men diverged, their bond endured, etched into the history of Israel, immortalized not in song or stone, but in the enduring power of love and loyalty between friends. In the story of David, amid battles, sins, and triumphs, the friendship with Jonathan stands as a testament to what it means to truly see another person, to honor them beyond titles, beyond fear, beyond envy. It is a story that whispers across generations that courage is not only in facing giants, but in loving and standing faithfully by the side of another, even when the world demands otherwise. And so the hills of Israel still echo with their laughter, their whispers, their promises. The memory of David and Jonathan lives on, not just as a tale of kings and warriors, but as a timeless testament to friendship, loyalty, and love, pure, unwavering, eternal.
Years in the wilderness. In the shadow of a throne he had not yet claimed, David ran. Not for adventure, not for glory, but for life itself. The land he had once called home, the streets of Jerusalem, now teemed with danger. For King Saul, once a fatherly figure, had become a hunter of his own anointed. A king consumed by jealousy, seeing in David the reflection of what he could never fully be, loved by the people, chosen by God, destined for greatness. David fled into the wilderness. He left behind his family, his home, the safety of the palace, and the fleeting comfort of his dreams. What lay before him were jagged cliffs, shadowed caves, and the silent expanse of the desert. But even in these desolate lands, David's heart carried a flame, one of faith, one of hope, one of unshakable trust in God. Days blended into nights, nights into days. The wilderness became both prison and sanctuary. In the hidden valleys and rocky hideouts, David gathered a band of men, fugitives, outcasts, the weary, the broken. Men who had no place in the kingdom, but found purpose in the wilderness with him. Each one bore scars, some from battles, others from betrayal, but all carried the same hunger, survival, loyalty, and the quiet hope that David's vision of a just kingdom would someday come to pass. Here, among the shadows, David's character was forged. He learned the art of patience, the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, not from a throne,
but from the raw necessities of survival. He became a shepherd once more, not of sheep, but of men, guiding, protecting, inspiring. Every decision, every plan, every night spent under the stars sharpened him for the crown that was still far from reach. Yet even in this life on the run, David wrestled with the human heart. He was hunted, yes, but he was not invincible. Fear stalked him as closely as Saul's soldiers. Hunger gnawed at his body. Loneliness pressed against his spirit. There were moments in the silence of the caves when he wondered if God had abandoned him, if the promise whispered to him by Samuel the prophet was nothing more than a fleeting dream. But it was in these very moments of despair that David's voice rose in song and prayer. The Psalms, those timeless hymns of lamentation and hope, were born in the wilderness. His heart poured into words, cries of anguish, whispers of faith, songs of deliverance. These were not just prayers, they were shields, armor against fear, reminders of a greater plan unseen by mortal eyes. The wilderness was not merely a place of hiding, it was a proving ground. David faced enemies who were not kings or armies, but his own moral challenges. Saul's men chased him relentlessly, but the wilderness forced him to confront the hunger for vengeance within himself. There were opportunities, moments when a single act could have ended Saul's life, could have catapulted David to the throne prematurely. Yet each time, David chose restraint, humility, and faith over ambition. He would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed, for he understood that timing, divine timing, cannot be rushed. In these rugged lands, alliances were forged. David's encounters with the Philistines, once enemies of Israel, taught him that survival often required cunning as much as courage. He learned to read the hearts of men, to sense betrayal before it struck, to act decisively when lives hung in the balance. His leadership became instinctive. His reputation grew, not as a king, not yet, but as a man of integrity, wisdom, and fearlessness. Even in the wilderness, tales of David's courage spread, whispers carried by the wind through the hills and valleys of Judah. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of all came from the solitude. The wilderness stripped away vanity, comfort, and pretense. David saw himself not as the hero others claimed him to be, but as a servant of God, small in stature, but immense in faith. Nights under the stars, listening to the wind through the caves, watching the sun rise over barren hills, David learned that true strength was quiet, patient, and rooted in righteousness. It was here, away from the glitter of the palace, that his soul was tempered, his vision clarified, and his resolve unbreakable. And still, danger never ceased. Saul's army pursued him relentlessly, yet David moved like a shadow, swift, careful, invisible. Friends were lost, some captured, some fallen. Each loss carried the weight of grief, each betrayal a bitter reminder of the fragility of trust. Yet through every hardship, David never wavered. He remained faithful not just to God, but to his own sense of justice and mercy. When he finally had Saul within his grasp, the moment to strike and claim his throne, David's hand stayed, his conscience held him back, for the wilderness had taught him a lesson the palace never could. Power without humility is a curse, not a blessing. These years in the wilderness were not just survival, they were preparation. Every trial, every song, every tear, every battle honed him for what lay ahead. The young shepherd boy from Bethlehem emerged not as a fugitive, but as a leader, a warrior, a man ready to shepherd a nation. The wilderness had been cruel, yes, but it had been kind in its own way. It had stripped him bare, yet built him whole. It had taken much, yet given more. And when the time came for David to step out of the shadows, to walk into the light of destiny, he did so with a heart tempered by faith, hands trained for leadership, and a spirit unbroken by fear. The wilderness was over, but its lessons would last forever.
In the rolling hills of ancient Israel, the air was heavy with tension. The armies of Israel and the Philistines clashed near the jagged cliffs of Mount Gilboa. The sun had barely risen, but the cries of battle had already torn through the morning mist. Among the Israelites, King Saul, once chosen and anointed by God, now fought not as a shepherd of his people, but as a man trapped in fear and despair. The shadow of his past decisions loomed over him, and the weight of his own jealousy gnawed at his soul. Saul's sons, noble yet untested, stood beside him. Jonathan, brave and loyal, the spark of hope in the king's family, carried his father's banner into the chaos. Abinadab and Malchishua followed, hearts filled with courage, yet heavy with foreboding. They knew the Philistine army was vast, relentless, and hungry for victory. The ground shook beneath the clash of chariots, the screech of swords, and the roar of warriors, a symphony of destruction echoing across the hills. As the battle unfolded, Saul's forces faltered. Fear had seeped into the hearts of the Israelites, turning their strength to trembling. Their weapons, once raised with righteous determination, now trembled in their hands. The Philistines, fierce and unyielding, pressed their advantage. Arrows darkened the sky. The ground itself seemed to quake with the weight of war. In the chaos, Saul saw the tide turning against him. His heart, once filled with divine purpose, now quivered with dread. Desperate, Saul sought to rally his men, to stand as the king who would not falter. But fate, cruel and unrelenting, had already begun its design. One by one, the sons of Saul fell, struck down by the enemy's hand. Jonathan, the faithful son, fell upon the field, a tragic figure of courage and devotion. Abinadab, Malchishua, all were cut down, their lives extinguished like candles in a storm. Saul, witnessing the death of his children, felt a darkness settle over his spirit, heavier than the blood-soaked dust beneath his feet. Wounded and cornered, Saul realized the inevitability of his own demise. The Philistines advanced, their eyes glinting with triumph, their swords thirsting for the final blow. In that moment, the king who had once stood tall and proud before the people of Israel made a fateful decision. He refused to allow his life to be claimed by the hands of his enemies, to be paraded as a trophy of their victory. With trembling hands and a heart heavy with sorrow, Saul fell upon his own sword, the weapon piercing through the armor of a once mighty king. Around him, the battlefield fell silent for a heartbeat, as though the earth itself paused to mourn. The Philistines, relentless, pressed on, claiming the bodies of the fallen, desecrating the corpses of Saul and his sons. The king who had been anointed, the man who had once stood in the presence of prophets, now lay among the dead, a tragic figure of pride, fear, and fatal decisions. Word of Saul's death spread quickly, carried on the winds to every corner of Israel. Among the people, grief mingled with relief, and whispers of fate and divine judgment stirred. Saul had been the first king of Israel, chosen to lead a nation into unity and glory, yet his reign ended not in triumph, but in tragedy and sorrow. His jealousy of David, his disobedience to God, and his inability to surrender to divine guidance had paved the way for his downfall. Meanwhile, in the wilderness, David received the news through a messenger, a breathless figure trembling with fear and grief. Though Saul had sought his life,
Though he had hunted David relentlessly, a bond of loyalty and respect remained. David wept. He tore his clothes in mourning, his lament echoing across the hills. The death of Saul was not only the fall of a king, but the death of a chapter in Israel's history, a story of human frailty, ambition, and divine will.
David's lament, spoken with voice heavy with sorrow and reverence, carried the weight of generations. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan, my brother, you were slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How have the mighty fallen? These words sung across the hills became more than an expression of grief. They became a testament to honor, respect, and the complexities of loyalty. The people of Israel, witnessing the mourning of David, felt a mixture of sorrow and hope. Saul was gone, his sons were gone, but the promise of a new king, one anointed and chosen by God, lingered on the horizon. David, the shepherd boy who had slain a giant and touched the heart of Israel with his courage and faith, would soon rise. But in this moment, the nation paused, reflecting on the costs of ambition, the weight of jealousy, and the fragility of human life. Saul's death was not merely an end, it was a turning point. It marked the close of an era, the final chapter of a reign filled with glory, fear, and missteps. Yet it also set the stage for a new beginning, a future where David would unite the tribes, build a kingdom, and leave a legacy that would echo through history. The battlefield on Mount Gilboa, stained with the blood of kings and sons, became a silent witness to the consequences of pride, the ravages of war, and the delicate balance of divine providence. As the sun set over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows over the valleys, one could almost hear the whispers of destiny. Saul, the first king, had fallen. Jonathan, brave and noble, had perished, and David, faithful and chosen, stood poised to rise. The story of Israel, written in the blood of the fallen and the tears of the mourners, was far from over. It was a story of courage, loss, loyalty, and the relentless march of fate. A story that would echo across generations, reminding all who heard it of the price of ambition and the power of destiny.
David becomes king.
In the aftermath of turmoil and bloodshed, the land of Israel lay restless. The shadow of King Saul's reign had passed, leaving a kingdom fractured, aching for a leader who could unite its people. Among the whispers of priests, soldiers, and shepherds, one name rose above all: David. David, the shepherd boy who once tended his father's flocks in the hills of Bethlehem, now stood on the precipice of destiny. He was no longer the boy anointed by Samuel in secret, no longer the young man who faced giants with nothing but faith and a sling. The battles of his past, Goliath, Saul's jealousy, the exile from his own home, had forged him, tempered him, and prepared him for this singular purpose: to rule over Israel with justice and courage. The news traveled quickly. In Hebron, the leaders of Judah gathered to crown David as their king. The city streets were alive with anticipation. People leaned from windows and doorways, whispering stories of his victories, of the courage he had shown in the wilderness, of the songs he had sung in praise of the Lord during the lonely nights. Here was a man who had known fear, betrayal, and sorrow, yet who had risen undaunted, guided by a hand greater than his own. David stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice,
strong but tempered with humility, carried through the narrow streets. "I am not here to rule for my own glory. I have been called, as all of you know, to serve this land and its people. Let us remember the Lord, who has brought us through trials, who has delivered us from our enemies, and who has given us hope in the darkest hours." The people cheered, a roar of approval that echoed through the hills. For the first time in years, a sense of unity began to weave itself into the fabric of Israel. David's kingship was not merely a change of ruler, it was a symbol of renewal, a promise that the covenant between God and his people would endure. Yet David knew the road ahead would not be without challenge. Israel was divided. The northern tribes had yet to accept his authority, and neighboring nations watched closely, wary of a strong leader rising from the shadows of war. Yet David had learned long ago that strength alone was not enough. Leadership required wisdom, patience, and a heart that sought justice above all else. He sent emissaries to the northern tribes, extending an olive branch, speaking not of conquest, but of unity. Slowly, the northern tribes came to see what Judah already knew, that David's vision was of peace and prosperity. One by one, they pledged their allegiance. Jerusalem, a city of strategic importance, yet neutral in allegiance, would become the heart of David's kingdom. Taking Jerusalem was no small feat. The city, known then as Jebus, was heavily fortified. Its walls were thick, its gates guarded, and its people proud and defiant. David did not rush in blindly. He studied the city, observed the guards, and found a secret path known only to a few. In a night marked by stealth and courage, he led his men through the hidden entrance, and Jerusalem fell under his control. The city would henceforth be called the City of David, the enduring seat of his kingdom. With Jerusalem secure, David turned his attention to the Ark of the Covenant. The sacred chest, symbol of God's presence among his people, had long been separated from the city. David understood that true leadership required not just political power, but spiritual authority. In a procession marked by music, dancing, and devotion, David brought the ark into Jerusalem. He leaped and danced before the Lord with all his might, his heart poured out in worship. The people followed, singing and celebrating, their voices lifting as one in praise and recognition of the God who had guided them through the wilderness of uncertainty into the promise of a united kingdom. David's reign began not merely with celebration, but with acts that would define his legacy. He established judges to uphold the law, creating a system where justice would be administered fairly. He strengthened the army, not to oppress, but to protect. He forged alliances through marriage and diplomacy, bringing stability to a land once torn by war. Yet, even as he consolidated his power, David remained a man of profound faith. He continued to write psalms, pouring his soul into songs that would resonate for generations. Through joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, David's devotion to God guided his decisions, shaping a reign that would be remembered for centuries. But David's story also serves as a reminder that kingship is never without its trials. The choices of a king carry weight far beyond personal consequence. In the days to come, he would face rebellion, betrayal, and heartbreak. Yet through every challenge, his heart returned to the God who had called him from the fields of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel. As David sat upon his throne in Jerusalem, the sun setting over the hills that once cradled him as a shepherd, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The battles, the losses, the faith that sustained him, all were threads woven into the tapestry of his life. And though he knew the path forward would be fraught with trials, he also knew that he was ready. David had become king. Not through the sword alone, not through cunning, but through courage, faith, and an unwavering heart devoted to justice and the Lord. The kingdom of Israel would remember this day, not only as the crowning of a man, but as the dawn of an era where hope, unity, and faith walked hand in hand. And so the shepherd who once wandered among the hills of Bethlehem, tending sheep and dreaming of a destiny only God could reveal, now ruled a nation. His heart, still humble, still steadfast, guided the people through light and shadow. David's kingship was not the end of his story, but the fulfillment of a calling, a promise that greatness is born not of birthright, but of courage, faith, and devotion to a purpose greater than oneself.
In the quiet after the storm of battle, when the dust of conquest had settled over Israel, David stood beneath the stars, weary yet unbroken. He had fought, he had won, and he had fallen, and yet somehow he was still chosen. The people of Israel looked to him not just as a king, but as a shepherd, a warrior, a man after God's own heart. But even in all of his victories, David knew that his greatest triumph was not on the battlefield. His greatest victory would be a promise, a covenant that would echo through eternity. It was in the stillness of a night unlike any other that God spoke to David, not through a messenger, not through an angel, but directly to his heart. The prophet Nathan had come to him, carrying words that would change the course of history. Nathan said, "Go, tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people Israel, and I have been with you wherever you have gone." David listened. His heart swelled with awe and yet trembled with humility. How could a boy from Bethlehem, a shepherd who had once hidden in caves, be the one chosen to lead a nation? How could his life, so ordinary and frail, be touched by the hand of the Almighty in such an extraordinary way? But God's words were not merely about the past. They carried a promise for the future, a covenant that would stand unbroken through the ages. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. Your offspring and your kingdom shall endure forever before me, and your throne shall be established forever. Imagine David in that moment, seated in the solitude of his chambers, hearing this divine decree, the weight of eternity pressed upon him. This was not simply a promise of a kingdom, but a promise of lineage, of a future that stretched far beyond his own lifetime. Every decision he made, every battle he fought, every song he sang in worship, now bore the weight of this eternal covenant. David fell to his knees, overwhelmed. He was a man of flesh and blood, yet he glimpsed something beyond the veil of time. He saw generations yet unborn, a lineage that would carry the light of God's promise through ages of turmoil and triumph. His heart trembled with gratitude, for he understood that this covenant was not merely a gift to him, it was a gift to all of Israel, a beacon of hope for a people who had known exile, oppression, and despair. And so David sang. The psalms that poured from his lips were no longer just songs of a shepherd or a warrior. They became songs of a king whose heart had been touched by the eternal. Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and the earth is yours. Yours, O Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all.
These words were not merely prayers, they were declarations of faith, a reflection of the covenant that God had placed upon his life. David understood that to be chosen by God was both an honor and a responsibility. It meant justice, mercy, and the relentless pursuit of righteousness. It meant humility, even in triumph, and steadfast devotion, even in despair. But the covenant was without its weight. David would face trials, personal failures, rebellion, and heartbreak, but the promise of God's covenant remained firm. It was a reminder that even a man who stumbles, even a king who errs, can still be part of a divine plan greater than himself. The covenant would outlast the fleeting struggles of any one lifetime. It would shape the destiny of a nation and eventually the world. God's covenant with David was more than a political or earthly promise. It was a spiritual blueprint, a foretelling of hope and redemption. The throne of David would not merely be a seat of power, it would become a symbol of God's eternal kingdom. And in this covenant, generations of prophets, kings, and faithful men and women would see the shadow of a coming Messiah, the one who would reign forever and bring light to all nations. David, the shepherd boy who had tended sheep under the open sky, the young warrior who had faced giants, now understood the magnitude of God's plan. He was chosen not for his strength alone, not for his victories on the battlefield, but because his heart was aligned with God's. He was a man after God's own heart, and through him, God's promise would unfold generation after generation until the fullness of time. And so, as the night deepened and the stars shimmered like diamonds scattered across the heavens, David whispered a vow of his own, a vow to honor the covenant, to lead with righteousness, and to walk humbly before the Lord. He knew that every decision, every triumph, and every failure would be measured not only by human standards, but by the eternal promise that God had placed upon him. The covenant was eternal, the promise was unbreakable, and David, the shepherd, the warrior, the king, would forever be remembered not just for his deeds, but for his faith. In God's covenant, David found his purpose, his mission, and his hope, and in the hearts of those who would come after him, that covenant would resonate for all time, a reminder that the hand of God moves through the lives of the humble, the faithful, and the brave.
In the quiet of the royal palace, King David sat restless. The night air whispered through the city of Jerusalem, carrying the faint sounds of the bustling streets below. Yet within the walls of the palace there was only stillness, a stillness that seemed to press upon him, a weight he could not name. He had conquered nations, defeated armies, and established a kingdom that would be remembered for generations. And yet, in this moment, power felt hollow, and the heart of a man, even a king, was still capable of longing, desire, and weakness. It was during one of these nights that David's eyes wandered, as if pulled by an invisible thread, to a rooftop where he could see the life of his city unfold. And there she was, Bathsheba. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, graceful, radiant, her beauty glowing even in the muted light of evening. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier in David's army, one of the brave men who had fought for David's kingdom. But in that moment, loyalty, honor, and morality seemed distant to the king. His heart, guided by desire, whispered a dangerous invitation to take what was not his. David sent for her. The messenger, carrying the king's command, delivered it without hesitation, unaware of the storm it would unleash. And when Bathsheba arrived, she did so with the trust and innocence of a woman who had no reason to suspect
the consequences of a king's desire. The room was silent, but for the soft murmur of their exchange, the air thick with tension. That night, desire overcame reason, and David's actions set in motion a series of choices that would forever alter the course of his life and the kingdom he ruled. Bathsheba returned to her home, unaware of the magnitude of what had begun, only to find herself carrying a child conceived in secrecy and sin. The king, realizing the potential scandal, sought to cover his wrongdoing, attempting to bend fate and justice to his will. He called for Uriah to return from the battlefield, hoping that the soldier would be with his wife and the child could be passed as legitimate. But Uriah, a man of honor and devotion, refused. He would not indulge in comfort while his brothers in arms still fought, while his comrades shed blood on the hills far from home. His integrity shone brightly, even in the shadow of the king's desperation. The king's plan faltered, and frustration turned to a darker resolve. The king, wielding his power with the precision of one accustomed to victory in battle, ordered Uriah to be placed in the fiercest part of the war, where the enemy was strongest and danger greatest. There, in the chaos of battle, Uriah fell. A loyal soldier, a devoted husband, a man of integrity, taken by the consequences of another's sin. Bathsheba mourned, as any would, her sorrow deepened by the complex and unspoken truth of her child's conception. And the king, in his triumph, felt a hollow victory, a victory that bore no joy. The kingdom sang of his might, yet the throne felt heavier than ever. It was then that the prophet Nathan came to him, a messenger of God's truth, unafraid to confront a king with the weight of his own conscience. Nathan's voice, steady yet piercing, told a story of a rich man who took what was not his, leaving the poor man bereft of his only lamb. David listened, initially with defiance, until the mirror of the parable revealed the reflection of his own sin. And in that moment, David's heart broke, not for the shame of being caught, not for the fear of judgment, but for the recognition of the wrong he had done. He cried out to God, a man humbled, a king undone by his own actions, seeking forgiveness that only mercy could grant. "I have sinned against the Lord," he confessed, his voice echoing through the silent halls of the palace, through the corridors of his own conscience. And while God's forgiveness came, it did not erase the consequences. The child born of that night's sin fell ill, and despite David's prayers, the child died. The king and Bathsheba endured grief, a poignant reminder that some actions, though forgiven, carry a weight that the world cannot undo. But life, even in its sorrow, finds a way to move forward. David, chastened but not broken, continued to reign, and Bathsheba, though scarred by tragedy, remained part of the royal story. Their lives intertwined not just by desire and sin, but by the complex realities of human nature: desire, power, regret, and the hope of redemption. And from this union, in time, came Solomon, a son who would inherit not only the throne, but the lessons of a father's failure, a kingdom tempered by wisdom born of pain. The story of David and Bathsheba is not just a tale of sin, it is a mirror of humanity. It reminds us that even the greatest among us are flawed, that desire can blind even the wise, and that true repentance is measured not only by confession, but acknowledgement of consequence. It teaches that forgiveness may be granted, but life's scars remain as markers, guiding those who follow to tread with humility, integrity, and a deep awareness of the fragility of the human heart. In the quiet of the night, Long after the palace lamps have dimmed, the story lingers, a lesson etched into the annals of history, a warning whispered through time. Even kings with power unmatched are not immune to the tempests of the heart. And in the story of David and Bathsheba, we find not just the sin of a man, but the profound truth of our own struggles, the enduring hope for redemption, and the reminder that even from the deepest failures, life, grace, and wisdom can emerge.
The throne of Israel stood firm. The enemies of the kingdom were subdued. The borders were secure. But within the palace of Jerusalem, a storm was rising, not from foreign armies, but from David's own house. This was the beginning of sorrow. After his great sin with Bathsheba and the arranged death of Uriah, the prophet Nathan stood before David and declared the judgment of the Lord. "The sword shall never depart from your house." The words lingered like a shadow over the royal chambers, and in time they would come to pass. Among David's sons was Amnon, the firstborn, heir apparent, admired, privileged. And there was Tamar, David's daughter, beautiful, innocent, royal in dignity. Amnon became obsessed with Tamar. What began as desire turned into a consuming fixation. Guided by the cunning counsel of his cousin Jonadab, Amnon devised a plan. He pretended to be ill. He requested that Tamar come to prepare food for him. Inside the quiet chamber of the king's son, where trust should have lived, violence was born. Amnon overpowered her. When his lust was satisfied, his affection turned to hatred. He cast her out in shame. Tamar tore her robe, the garment of virgin royalty, and placed ashes upon her head. She wept as she walked through the palace corridors. And when her brother Absalom saw her, he understood. David heard of it. The king burned with anger, but he did nothing. No justice, no judgment, no discipline. The silence of the throne planted seeds of vengeance. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, said nothing publicly, but for 2 years he carried his hatred quietly. Then came the feast at Baal Hazor. All the king's sons were invited. Laughter filled the air. Wine flowed freely. The atmosphere felt harmless, celebratory. But it was a trap. At Absalom's command, his servants struck down Amnon. The heir to the throne was dead. The palace trembled again. Absalom fled to Geshur, where he remained in exile for 3 years. David mourned, not only for Amnon, but for the living son he had lost to bitterness. Eventually, through the intervention of his military commander Joab, Absalom was permitted to return to Jerusalem, but reconciliation never truly came. David allowed him back into the city, yet refused to see his face. Distance hardened into resentment, and resentment would soon become rebellion. Absalom was striking in appearance. Scripture records that from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Charismatic, handsome, persuasive, he stood at the city gates early each morning. When citizens seeking justice from King David came to seek justice, Absalom would intercept them. "If only I were appointed judge, then every man would receive justice," he would say. He kissed their hands. He won their hearts. For 4 years, he slowly stole the loyalty of Israel. Then he made his move. Under the pretense of fulfilling a vow in Hebron, Absalom declared himself king. Trumpets sounded. Conspirators gathered. Even one of David's trusted counselors, Ahithophel, joined the rebellion.
The report reached Jerusalem. The arts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And David knew the prophecy was unfolding. David did not fortify the palace. He did not call for immediate bloodshed. He fled, barefoot, weeping, crossing the Kidron Valley. The same shepherd who once faced Goliath now walked away from his own throne. Priests carried the Ark of the Covenant with him, but David stopped them. "If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back. But if not, let him do to me what seems good to him." It was not fear that drove him, it was submission. As he ascended the Mount of Olives, curses followed him. A man named Shimei hurled stones and accusations, calling him a man of blood. David refused retaliation. Let him curse. Perhaps the Lord has told him to. The broken king understood something few rulers ever do. Some battles are consequences. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem. He sought counsel from Ahithophel, whose advice was considered as if one had inquired of God himself. Ahithophel urged swift pursuit. Strike David immediately while he is weak. But through divine providence, another counselor, Hushai, delayed the attack with an alternative strategy. The delay saved David. Time allowed him to regroup beyond the Jordan River. Armies assembled. The inevitable clash approached, father against son. Before battle, David gave a command to his generals, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." Even in betrayal, David's heart was still that of a father. The battle erupted in the forest of Ephraim. It was brutal. 20,000 men fell that day, but the forest claimed more lives than the sword. And then Absalom fled. Riding his mule beneath the thick branches of a great oak, his magnificent hair, once a symbol of pride, became his snare. It caught in the tree. The mule ran on. Absalom hung suspended between heaven and earth, helpless. A soldier reported it to Joab. Ignoring David's command, Joab took 3 javelins and thrust them into Absalom's heart. The rebellion ended under that tree. News reached David. The young man Absalom is dead. Victory had come, but there was no celebration. The king went to the chamber above the gate and wept. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you." The conqueror of giants could not conquer grief. The warrior poet who wrote psalms of triumph now cried the deepest lament of his life. The rebellion was crushed, but the cost was unbearable. David returned to Jerusalem, not in triumph, but in humility. His authority was restored, yet the kingdom was fragile. The sword had not departed from his house. Family tragedy had scarred the royal line. And still, through brokenness, God's covenant endured. From this fractured dynasty would one day come another son of David, not one who would seize power, but one who would bear sin. The story of David's family is not merely political history. It is a cautionary tale of unchecked desire, parental failure, ambition, and pride. It is also a testimony that even in rebellion and ruin, mercy can still write the final chapter. The shepherd king had learned the hardest lesson of all. Victory over enemies is easier than ruling one's own heart. And sometimes the deepest wounds come not from the battlefield, but from home.
In the twilight of his reign, King David, the shepherd boy who became Israel's greatest monarch, had seen it all. He had tasted victory, faced betrayal, and been anointed by God himself. Yet even a king so mighty could not escape the trials of old age. The years had weighed upon him, and the golden hair of his youth had faded into silver. His body grew frail, his steps slower, yet the flame of his spirit still burned bright. The kingdom he had built with sweat and tears was prosperous. Cities rose, the walls of Jerusalem stood firm, and the temple of the Lord, a vision he longed to see completed, was being prepared by his son Solomon. But David's heart, once ablaze with passion and conquest, now wrestled with a quieter, more personal battle: the weight of time, the uncertainty of succession, and the whispering shadows of his own mortality. Even in his old age, David remained a man of immense vitality, if not in body, then in mind and spirit. Yet the palace halls, once filled with the laughter of warriors and servants, now echoed with intrigue and subtle schemes. David's sons, like the sons of kings throughout history, were not all equally faithful or wise. Among them, Absalom's rebellion still lingered in memory, a bitter reminder that even the blood of kings cannot guarantee loyalty. And then there was Adonijah, ambitious and restless, whose desires for the throne would soon draw him into a dangerous game. In these later years, David faced his final, perhaps greatest test, not in battle, but in judgment. He knew that God had a plan, and that the kingdom's future rested not on the strength of arms, but on obedience, wisdom, and faith. He understood that Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, the quiet and contemplative prince, was the one chosen to continue his legacy. But the world does not easily yield to divine will. Human ambition is a force as untamable as any raging army, and David would have to navigate it carefully, with discernment born from decades of experience. It was during this time that Adonijah, seizing the opportunity that often presents itself when a king grows old, proclaimed himself king. The courtiers whispered, some in fear, others in hope. The air was thick with tension, as if the stones of Jerusalem themselves held their breath. Adonijah had allies: Joab, the seasoned general whose loyalty had always been to strength rather than principle, and Abiathar, the priest whose counsel was now swayed by ambition. Together they plotted, confident that David's age and frailty made resistance impossible. But David, though his body ached and his hair had turned white, was not a man to be easily outwitted. With the wisdom of years, he called upon the prophet Nathan and the faithful priest Zadok. They reminded him of God's promise, and together they acted swiftly. David publicly anointed Solomon as king in the presence of the people and the armies of Israel. The proclamation rang out like a trumpet, a declaration not of human power, but of divine choice. In that moment, the air seemed to shimmer with destiny fulfilled. Adonijah's ambition crumbled as swiftly as it had risen. Fear replaced confidence. Those who had once whispered words of support now fell silent, watching as the rightful king took his throne, not by sword, but by the hand of God. David's eyes, though weary, shone with quiet satisfaction. He had guided his people through rebellion, betrayal, and political intrigue. He had ensured that the covenant, the sacred promise that bound Israel to God, would continue through Solomon.
In these final days, David also turned his heart inward. He reflected upon his life with all its triumphs and failures. He remembered the hills of Bethlehem, where he had watched sheep beneath the silent stars. He remembered Goliath, the giant whose shadow had once darkened the valley, and the victory that had marked the beginning of his rise. He remembered Saul, whose jealousy had driven him to hide in caves and forests, and the mercy he had extended despite all wrongs. And he remembered Bathsheba, the love and pain entwined in the story of his family, the choices that had brought both blessing and strife.
David's penultimate test was not against armies or giants, but against the very human forces of pride, impatience, and the temptation to cling too tightly to power. He knew that even a king must sometimes step aside, must recognize that God's plan surpasses human desire. By choosing Solomon, he displayed the humility of a man who had learned, through decades of triumph and failure, that leadership is not possession, it is stewardship. Even as his health waned, David's spirit remained unbroken. He spent hours in prayer and contemplation, seeking the Lord's guidance and blessing upon Solomon. He imparted wisdom that would echo through generations, teaching that justice, mercy, and faithfulness are the true marks of a king. He reminded Solomon of the responsibility to honor God, to lead with integrity, and to love his people with a heart both strong and compassionate.
And then, as the sun dipped low and the shadows of his life stretched long, David felt the final pull of the years. His time on earth was ending, but the story he had lived, the shepherd boy who became king, the poet, the warrior, the sinner, the faithful servant of God, would endure. His legacy would be carried not in monuments of stone, but in the living memory of a nation and in the guidance of the Son he had anointed to rule. In the quiet moments before his passing, David looked upon Jerusalem, his city, his heart, his home. He remembered the battles fought, the songs sung, the prayers whispered in solitude, and he felt peace, for he had lived as God intended, fully and without compromise. He had faced trials, made mistakes, and yet had remained faithful. And in his final test, he had passed, not through strength of arms, but through wisdom, obedience, and the courage to place his trust entirely in the Lord. Thus ended the reign of David, a king after God's own heart. His life, a tapestry of triumph and failure, love and loss, power and humility, became legend. And though his voice would fall silent, the story of the shepherd who became king, the man who faced giants and yet bowed to God, would resonate forever, a reminder that true greatness lies not in conquest alone, but in faith, wisdom, and unwavering devotion.
And so, the story of David comes to its quiet end. From the lonely hills of Bethlehem, where a young shepherd once watched over his father's sheep, to the throne of Israel, where a king carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, David was not a perfect man. He knew victory, and he knew failure. He walked in courage, and at times stumbled in weakness. Yet through every triumph and every fall, one truth remained. His heart kept turning back to God. That is why history remembers him not only as a warrior, not only as a king, but as a man after God's own heart. His songs became the Psalms, his kingdom shaped a nation, and his legacy would prepare the way for a greater king yet to come. David's life reminds us that greatness is not born in perfection, but in faith, repentance, and trust in God. And even now, thousands of years later, the Shepherd King's story still echoes through time.
If this story of David inspired you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves powerful stories of faith and history. And if you want to experience more epic biblical stories brought to life, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next journey through the pages of the Bible. Thank you for watching, and may peace be with you.